Well, welcome. I'm Grady King with Hope Network, and I'm delighted to have a friend and someone who I've respected a long time for his work with churches, Dr. Don's what I call him, Dr. Don Hebbard. Welcome, Don. We're glad you're here today.
Thanks, Grady. Good to be with you. Thanks.
Well, Don has written a book recently that was born out of his life in helping churches transition and doing health work in congregations, and it's called Healing Hurting Churches. And the subtitle is interesting, the economy process. Did I say that right?
You did.
All right. And good Greek word there. We'll get to that in just a moment. So we're talking today about your book, Don. And before we get really going, tell us a little bit about you, your education, family, background.
Sure. Well, I'm a professor of marriage and family therapy at Amberton University here in Dallas, and work with restoration counseling in their leadership team, big counseling practice over Fort Worth. But my education background is at Abilene Christian. I went there and studied to be a preacher. I did my undergraduate degree in ministry and my first master's in Bible and communications under Tom Albright and Carl Spain back in the day.
Wow, great guys.
Great guys. And while I was doing that, I was grad assistant for Paul Faulkner, and he had just launched the new Marriage and Family Institute out there when marriage and family therapy was just in its infancy. He was a real pioneer. Mm-hmm. And he came to me, said, I was headed to OU to do my doctorate in communications. I was going to be a speech teacher and do preaching as well. But he said, you'd be a real good marriage shrink, so why don't you stay here? I put you in the program. So I stayed on, and that was a real life-changing event for me because he introduced me to systems theory, family systems theory, which was new at the time, just coming on board, where we thought of human interaction patterns and what all that means. When I got through at Abilene, got through with that program, moved back to Dallas, moved to Irving, South MacArthur, where you and I both worked, and
yes.
opened a counseling center for them, and did my doctorate at TWU. And at TWU, there was a real phenomenal guy, Dr. Tom Eves, who I studied my doctoral work under in organizational consulting. And he was using systems theory to impact and change organizations. So it was the same theory, just used in a different context. So as I began working with churches in those early years, they would typically, something would happen, they'd blow up, there'd be this big event, and they'd holler at me, say, could you help us through?
Wow. Yeah.
So it just, God works in some real mysterious ways. The work I'd done with Dr. Faulkner and with Dr. Eves, I just immediately began applying in the situations that I was in as I went from church to church.
Well, that system stuff is I use it as well. And it's kind of the lens through which I view church and helping churches. And, I don't know why we're surprised about that. God put it in, 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12, the body, the eye and the hand and how the body functions. And so it's just been a great blessing. So when I see your title, Healing Hurting Churches, boy, in a sense, everybody has that, but in another sense, not. And so the economy process, what about the title and what prompted you to write this?
Yeah, the book the book was a surprise to me. One of our good buddies, James Cale, that we both love and admire so much, he and I were on the phone last April, and he said, you've been doing this work since about 1988, the late 80s. And he said, you need to write down what you've been doing. And I said, no, the last thing I want to do is write a book. But anyway, I got a notebook. I started taking some notes. I started on that thing last May, and by the end of August, I'd written 350 pages. I mean, it just it just exploded out.
Poured out of you.
Yeah, it just poured out. I had no idea. I was writing just massive amounts, and it was all coming together. And then a good colleague of mine, Dr. Sarah Blakeney, had an editor at Credo Publishing, Tim Beals. He took a look at it, said, said this would be tremendous help to folks. And so by Thanksgiving, we had it rolling out. So and what the prompting of it, to answer your question, I had been doing it for years, but I'd never really written down and systematized what was going on in my head as I approached these different cases with churches. So it was my effort to, it's like playing music without the notes. I've been playing it just freelancing for years. And so I finally put music to it and wrote the notes out of what I was doing in all these situations.
Oh, that's one thing I like about you. You're always finding images and stories that pull things together. And that's what really pulled me into the book, not just because I know you personally, but because as I begin to read, I'm thinking the stories are so engaging and they're real, and the names have been changed to protect the innocent and the guilty in lots of, the whole thing. But that's what did it. But this phrase, economou, there's personal background as well as theological background to that, right?
Yeah, there really is. And there really is. The theological background, of course, is Jesus when he's speaking and says that there are times that we need to appoint an economou, a manager of the household to care for things. And that's what Joseph was, evidently, in Potiphar's house. He was that economou who was charged with everything, that he owned, pretty much. So I've always been drawn to that image that when a church is in healing transition, there's somebody that's got to be in charge of that process. While I was doing this work, the personal side of it was, that's my biological name. I was born Peter Nicholas Economou. I'm Greek, and I was adopted into the Hebbard family when I was a year old. So I kind of lovingly and jokingly tell my kids, I think I was kind of born to do this. It was just kind of what I was stamped for.
Yeah, there's more than irony there. There's some really, well, that's really helpful, because that word, you're thinking, all right, the average person reading this goes, wait, economou, unless you have, so I'm thinking economou, where's that household, steward, however you want to say that. So one of the things I found very interesting is, of course, I do interim ministry all the time,
right?
And we do some healing aspects to it, but you differentiate between interim ministry and healing transitions. They dovetail, but one's what you're doing and what you've done. Differentiate that a little bit. Why does that matter? And what are some warning indicators, those flashing red lights of need for a healing transition? Just anywhere you want to go with that. So
yeah, great question. It's really at the beginning point of this whole thing. The work that you and John and so many of you all do is great. And the typical church is going to go through an interim transition and an interim ministry. They've been served well by a minister. Things are in pretty good shape. They're going to do their due diligence during that transition, bring a new guy in, and you have a seamless kind of move from one era to the next. The situations I was called into was, there is something that is significant that has happened in the life of that church that's going to prevent it from moving from one era to the next. And so the metaphor I use for that is, it's kind of the difference between, I want to get my shoulder in shape. I'm going to be a pitcher. So I'm going to go to Lifetime Fitness and work out my shoulder. That's interim ministry. The opposite is, I've got a rotator cuff tear and I need to go to the ER and be treated for that because, there's some wounding in there. And so it's a difference between going to the gym and going to the ER. It's two totally different worlds. And what happens is, if you go to the gym and you got a rotator cuff pull, you're going to make it worse instead of making it better.
Wow. That's really helpful. And so how do you discern when a church, because sometimes, I go into a church, or we go into a church in our work and in our ministry, and I'm thinking, I'm there 2 or 3 times, I'm realizing, let's put the brakes on here. Yep. You have no business getting a minister, starting this big process of finding a new minister, because there's some things you really got to work on. And sometimes I want to go, whoa, we need a healing orientation rather than an interim ministry. So I really appreciate that. What are some common just flashing red lights of what churches go through that would necessitate healing versus just jumping into interim work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Grady. And I usually there's usually three categories of red lights on the dashboard. The first one's going to be, and this is the one I get the call for the most. The first one's going to be there's some big crisis event. The preacher died. The whole eldership resigned. The IRS is investigating us. The preacher had an affair. I mean, there's been some big catastrophic event that has occurred, lightning bolt out of the blue, and the church lacks what we call in systems terms requisite variety. They don't have any tools in their tool belt to respond to that thing. And so they're calling me up and saying, this has just happened. We don't know what to do with this at all. Come over to Damascus and help us. Or they're reaching onto their tool belt and they're pulling out the wrong tools to deal with that situation. And they're doing some stuff that's making it worse, not making it better. So that's kind of the first category. The second one is one that you see a lot, and I do too. It's where they're in a loop. They're in a negative cycle that keeps happening over and over and over to them. And it's kind of like the movie Groundhog Day. They keep waking up, and every 3 or 4 years, the same thing keeps happening to them. So systemically, they're in a cycle. And you know as well as I do, that cycle's probably taking them down slowly. And so if we say to folks, if you feel like you've got the same thing happening to you over and over again, that's probably a sign you need a healing transition. Yep. And then the third one is more insidious. It's where there's been a series of smaller crises over a longer period of time, and it's had a ramping down effect. And so you see a church that's just exhausted, and they can't point to a big event, but there's just been a series of inadequacies over a long period of time.
Wow. I think what we need to do right now is just kind of take a little break, tell them how you can order the book, and then we'll go to part 2 in just a few seconds here. So you've intrigued me. I've read the book. I'm endorsed the book. So how do they get a hold of the book?
Yeah, the book is out on Amazon. It's available hardback or in Kindle. And you can just go to Amazon, order that thing up, and it'll come right to you. It's by Credo Publishing. Yeah.
Okay. And how would people get in contact with you if some church leader says, hey, I think we could use some healing. We need some help. How do I get a hold of Dr. Don?
Yeah, I have a website. It's just drdonhebbard.com. You can go out there and all my contact information is right there, and I'm available. Okay.
Well, this is part 1, folks, and there's going to be part 2 in just a few seconds. And so a few minutes, join us for part 2. Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of Dr. Don talking about his new book, Healing Hurting Churches, the Economou Process. And so let's kind of dive in a little bit. The book, Don, has 2 major sections. I boil it down to the wounds of a church and then the process you use. So talk a little bit about wounds and process. The wounds I found very descriptive, very interesting, because it comes down to people and habits and attitudes and behaviors. So talk about the wounds a bit and how you categorize the wounds.
Yeah, it's a great question, Grady. And I categorize them based on the churches that I've worked with over the years. They tended to fall in 5 or 6 different kinds or forms. You had churches that were just exhausted. They'd kind of used up their resources and were tired because they've had a series of problems. And then you have ones that are more incompetent. They just don't do things very well. Then you have ones that are a bit more difficult to go in and intervene on. You have the tough bargainer church, where you have someone who's real authoritarian and domineering. You have, unfortunately, the sexual church where there's sexual misbehavior and misconduct,
Right.
ethical
Right.
violations. You have the narcissistic church, the personality church, where one person's ego has been running the thing and everything's built around them. And then the one that I've never heard anybody write on this one. I kind of had to come up with this category myself, but it's the borderline church. And that's one of the hardest ones I work with. I'm not real successful with that one, but that's an attachment wound. That's one where they think they've got it all together, but they just keep running through people and never do attach with a particular minister or leader. So there are a lot of different forms of wounding out there, but I just found them. I found those 6 different types to be real characteristic of the ones I worked with. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes total sense, and I like the way you merge, systems theory, system and therapy, personal therapy, your experiences, the anecdotal stories that you share just keeps people engaged. That chapter on borderline was just, to me, it's worth the whole book from my perspective of the working with churches, because it's like the same pattern and over again. And it just, no matter what minister changes or what goes in there, that borderline church, I think of borderline personality disorder, but you didn't quite go that far, but it's implied, I think. So anyway, that's really good. So the process of once you recognize, you go in and do a lot of listening up front.
Yep.
A lot of storytelling. We are the stories we tell, I've learned, and we live the stories we tell.
Yep.
And so as we listen, we're thinking, wow, here's the themes of these stories they're telling about their church. But so your process involves, I assume, begins with listening.
Yeah, it really does. And a lot of the folks that have been hurt in these churches, as you know, have not heard anybody take them seriously through this process. But it's built really on four different pillars or activities. One is taking people into a healthy theology of church life and of leadership. And so we want to ground everything we're doing in the consulting process in solid biblical theology, and then do that in all the teaching and preaching that we do. The second piece to this thing is what I call process consultation, which involves assessment of the church, what's actually going on. And you and John and other consultants do this all the time. What we run into within a healing transition is, in that assessment, there's probably going to be first healing and then a reconstruction system-wide. In other words, it's not just replacing an eldership or replacing a minister like a Sears diehard battery. There's probably going to be systemically a lot of changes have to be made in order for the healing process to occur. So we give a congregation, and it usually takes at least a year to get through one of these things, time to grieve over whatever the losses have been.
Right.
Reorient themselves and kind of get their head around what the new reality is, and then reconstruct a vision and a leadership to take them into the future. So that's the whole process consultation part of this thing. And that's what I learned with Dr. Eves there at TWU. The third piece of this is inductive preaching. When we came out of graduate school, the whole expository preaching movement was really big. Everybody was moving to that from topical. And I wasn't going to be, I studied to be a preacher, but I wasn't going to be a preacher. I went a different direction. I was really influenced by inductive preaching. Lewis and their book, and then all the preaching that my mentors did, guys like Faulkner and Cale, and a lot of the guys in the Marriage and Family, they were inductive, which is storytelling preaching. And it's preaching that comes out of laying an individual story or a church's story next to the biblical text and merging those. And that's just, it's ideal for a healing transition because it allows the church's story to be told at that point. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, yes. I've heard you do some stuff with Joseph before,
Yep.
and other narratives in scripture. The bulk of the Bible is narrative.
Yep.
And so why would we be surprised about that? So I like the way you explain putting them side by side and having them blend and come across each other. That's awesome. That's awesome.
What we run into a lot of times in these churches that I'll work with, when you do that inductive preaching, people are just standing in line at the back of the door waiting to talk to you, not to comment about the sermon, but to tell you a story that they got to get off their chest. Well, it's like doing therapy on 1,000 people. It's allowing that narrative to come out and then allow that pain to be dealt with.
Wow, that's such a vivid way of saying that. I appreciate that so much. So, who's the target audience of this book? Who should really read, think about, discuss, dialogue about this book? I mean, who did you have a target audience in mind?
Yeah, I did. When I wrote it, it was funny. I was telling my editor when I first started about it, I said, this is not a book for everybody. I said, this is not going to be picked up by the average person. Oh yeah, let's read this. But for church leaders that are working with a congregation, and they may have that little question mark in the back of their mind, they may be going, there may be something going on here more than I have a handle on. And I really have a question that maybe we're not headed in the right direction. They may need to take a look at that. It's for church leaders where it's already obviously exploded and they've got problems. It's also for ministers who are in a situation like that borderline church. That borderline church is going to blame that minister for all their problems and dump on him. And he's going to feel like he's doing something wrong. And he's not. He's just in a system that's chewing him up.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's real interesting. God does some funny things. When I was writing that particular chapter, I got a call from a guy who was on staff in one of those churches. And he was talking to me about they just come in and just chewed all over him about and he wasn't doing anything wrong. So it's also for ministers who may be in a situation where they're having difficulties. And then the last audience that I really kind of want to spend the next few years maybe looking at is for people who may feel a calling to this ministry, who maybe can take the book and pick it up and go, I believe I could learn to. I feel I may have a calling to do this a little bit. And
so one of the interesting things is your background, marriage, family therapy and communication, preaching, theology. Somebody might be saying, I've got a heart for this, but I am not a therapist. How in the world am I going to do the kind of stuff Don's talked about? Can you give them a little pointers? Or there's hope for that. You don't have to be a therapist in order to do this work. You point that out.
No, you really don't. And you touched on it at the beginning of our talk a few minutes ago. And you're a great example of that. You're not a therapist, but you're a great listener. Systems theory as well as I do. You're very fluent in it. You listen and you learn from other people. And then I've seen you work. You go in and you craft some great exercises for churches to do that are very healing oriented. So someone who has a desire just to learn these particular skills can develop this, I think. Absolutely.
It does help. At 35 years of age, I wasn't ready to do anything like this. I might have understood it in my head, but I didn't understand it in my experience. And so, I have a friend named Tim, and he often says what churches often need in this kind of work is people who have lines on their face and scars in their heart. And I think that's a beautiful way of saying that. We're all wounded healers, in the phrase of Henry Nouwen. I mean, and so it's not like we've got it together. We're not tellers. We're more or less facilitators of bringing people along to discover their own realities, and we provide the guidepost along the way. So if you had to say one or two things, what are one or two things you want people to really know about this book that has a sense of hope with it?
Yeah. Well, the good news is when a church goes through a major crisis, when they're really wounded, I worked with some I've worked with some great elderships and some great ministers through the years. And when they will work a healing process, a church can be restored. A church is a spiritual emotional system. It's not an organizational chart. It's not like any other entity in the world. And when it's treated with spiritual as well as emotional care, if you'll give that church time and not rush it, not push it, but give it time to reconstruct itself, then that church can enter a whole new era and vision for ministry. And I've seen elders do that and come through this thing in real good shape. But
Well,
you got to do the work.
Yeah, you got to do the work. Are you willing to do the work? I mean, sometimes we come into churches and they say they're all excited to have us. And after the first couple of sessions, they're going, you feel this pushback, pushing back, you feel this resistance. And I'm going to say, they're saying, well, man, this is a long process. This is a lot of work. And I'm saying, I know. What price are you willing to pay? Is this worth it? Look at where you've been. And some say, no, we're not ready for this. Yep. And they continue like they are, but that's their choice. Like any good therapist said, that's your choice. You don't have to come back and see me if you don't want to.
That's exactly right.
So you can get Healing Hurting Churches, the Economy Process by Dr. Don Hebbard on Amazon. And your website is, again?
Dr. Don Hebbard.
Dr. Don Hebbard. You can find him there and contact him there. Don, thank you for taking time to talk about your book, but it's not just your book. It's really for the kingdom and the health of the body of Christ. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Grady. Enjoyed it. Always enjoy being with you.